Okay. Thank y'all for joining us on another episode of Potheads Pondering. I'm Lotta with the Bakersmen Collective, and today we have Matt in the building. Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. My name is Matt. I've been working in cannabis almost 10 years now. It might be 10 years by now, but yeah, I go by he, him. I've worked in a lot of different facets of cannabis. Got started really just because I was passionate about it. So here we are, you and I met at the Oregon Growers Cup last year, kind of like late December.
But yes, we met at the Growers Cup. Actually, like I was talking earlier, right before my car accident, that the footage is out there if you want to see what went down.
Yeah.
And we had a time catching up, Alice and I, going through the Growers Cup, and we had such a wonderful conversation. I was like, man, you ever want to be on a podcast? And fast forward to pitching something off the cuff like that, off of just good vibes and energy. Here we are because we had some common interest.
Yeah.
But with this being Potheads Pondering, we like to just kind of slow it down, let the audience get to know our guest. And so, what do you think makes you a pothead? If you're going to be on the show, you're defining yourself as one. So,
For me personally, it's you got to have the passion, right? That's where it starts. You got to be passionate about either consuming or growing it or both. Um, all the old dated terminology aside, I think being a daily user or regular user also helps. Um, but yeah, you don't have to be zooted all day long. There's no need for that, but
mhm.
there's no problem if you are, right?
Right.
So for me personally, it's about consuming on a regular basis and being passionate about the plant.
I love that. It's real simple, real straightforward. And I think more people need to get aligned because I think there's a lot of judgment in this world, but in the cannabis space, it was like, well, if you don't have, if you're not facing backwoods daily, you're not a real smoker, or
Right.
if you don't do 1 gram dabs, you're not this, and that same energy is like when we all first started smoking. You gotta hold it in. If you don't hold it in, then like science tells you none of that shit's real. So you
It's
can
the same like don't break the box mentality.
right. Wait, explain that mentality.
When maybe you're in the car, maybe you're in a small room, everybody's in there loaded in. You've boxed the whole place, right? Maybe you got like multiple blunts, multiple joints in rotation. And then there's always one person that needs a little air, right? Maybe they're getting hot, maybe they just smoke is too much. There's just like the stigma about breaking the box. Like first person that opens the door, it's like you're out of the circle. And
Right.
I haven't had to hear that in a long time, but it's that same mentality.
Right, it's weird because oxygen and airflow, baby,
Yeah.
it needs to be had, and I think you wouldn't hear that working in the legal industry more so because we're very cautious about our ventilation. There's
Yeah.
lots of guidelines around that. It's like, and not just us. Like when you're trying to get it legalized, that's all the senators and legislators, all those people want to talk about is what's the air quality like? Is it gonna smell like weed when you're growing?
Oh my gosh.
It's the dumbest stuff. It seems like the dumbest stuff, but when your job is to be concerned about the health of the public, then you are worried about the impact that something small can have. Now there are those
Right.
that use it to control the plant, but we don't promote them on our show.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
what got you into pot?
Well, honestly, started out as a medical patient, 2010, 2011, and back then you could still be like 18 and get your card. I was living in California, have a chronic pain condition, and honestly, I just went through every single medication they could give me. I did all the treatments that was possible, holistic and Western medicine, Eastern medicine, and I just wasn't finding relief. I had a couple of friends that were like, "Hey, man, like, medical cannabis is legal, and you're like a good candidate." And so that's kind of how I got into it. And I mean, it didn't completely change my life entirely, but cannabis, it gave me another option. Um, It just made it easier for me to cope with the physical ailment, the chronic pain, and yeah, just kind of became pretty passionate about it then.
I love
Um,
that. I love that.
yeah, and
Like
so
that's
like that's really
early.
how it started.
That's very early because like okay, so there's prop what was it,
215,
215, and that was
yeah,
like in the
SB 420.
90s,
Mm-hmm.
and then SB 420. So then in 2010 you already like have an established market, if you will, of treating can, but it's like delivery at that time, I think, for the
Yeah,
most
so
part.
where I'm from in San Diego, there were some storefronts, and man, back then it was like all about the FTP, right? So it was like first time patient gifts, and that was like the incentive to get you in the door, and the stuff that we don't see anymore, really. But it was also a way for these dispensaries to give back to patients. Um, and back then you had to be like in the club, so you had to be known as a member of the cooperative, and like that's how you got in. So the structure was super different. um I'd say probably like around 2014, 15, that's when you stop seeing actual storefronts, because I was working in the industry by that point. I worked at a retailer in San Diego, and then yeah, we had to shutter, and we were one of the lucky few that got to be a delivery service. And I say that because there's a lot of others that they just got shut down outright, and that was
Right.
it.
And you had to shutter because it was becoming from medical to recreational, so adult use at that point.
Almost. It was like right before that, actually. But basically, the city just said, we don't want these here anymore. We don't want storefronts. And this is, San Diego circa 2015, around then.
Right. Got you. Got you. Got you. So that experience with then getting access to medical cannabis, is that what fueled you to get into the industry? Like having access and then losing access, did that fuel you to get closer to the plant or what?
Honestly, it was a little more serendipitous than that, in that I had a spot that I was going to regularly. So it's like I was getting delivery. The delivery service opened a storefront. And then by that time, I had already educated myself a lot about strains, about effects, about the things that kind of that I needed to know for myself, because I had a couple of just experiences going to dispensaries back in 2010, 2011, where the language started to change, as well as the lay of the land started to change. So it wasn't really the crunchy stoner that I was talking to anymore. I was talking to, a very different crop of people that were entering the market, where the descriptors stopped being about pain relief. It stopped being about medicine, and it started about being everything was fire. Um, Something, things were the gas, and that's fine, right? Like, but when you're coming from like like the medicinal side, and you have an ailment you're trying to treat, when you're trying to find that strain that works for you, or that product that works for you, when somebody tells you, hey, this is fire, that's not going to do a lot for you, especially if you're not of that generation where you understand, hey, this is the best thing what we have, like you can decipher the lingo. Um, and so when this change started to happen, I started to see some of the older heads be really turned off by it. People that were, also shopping as like medical marijuana consumers. And I could see it. I could see it happening. And so I think what happened, again, just kind of circle back, I walked into the store and they just asked me if I wanted a job. It was it was like that. They knew me as being this knowledgeable customer. I frequented the spot, and I was pretty straightforward about what I needed. I came in and I was educated and I knew what I wanted. So they'd be like, I wasn't the person that goes to the dispensary and I'm like, okay, well, what's the best one? Like, I knew what I was looking for. I looked at the menu already. Most of the times I knew what worked for me. Um, and that kind of stemmed from somebody telling me GDP was probably the best for pain relief, and it didn't do much for me. And I learned about chemotypes. I learned about all these things. And so I think really what happened is the store owner wanted somebody that knew that and that could bridge the gap for the customer. So that's how I got my start. Just being knowledgeable about cannabis and just being passionate. I guess being a pothead, really, like what we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Okay. That's a breath of fresh air for some folks that right now, like, I mean, I work in a pot shop 5 days a week, and daily we get consumer customers of all ages. It's like, well, how do you get a job here? You know what I mean? And it's not too straightforward in at my place just because of how their application process. But when I tell them that, like, most of them is like, well, we really like weed. I'm like, that's not enough now. Liking, like, you need to be able to set yourself apart from everyone that likes weed because, well, it's popular. But do you have the knowledge basis that you could then evaluate this product in front of you and see if it fits the needs of the person who's expressing them on the other side? Do you have the conversation skills to get them to express what they need? Do you have the math capabilities to run numbers and do the budgets? There's a lot more that goes into being a bud tender. And I'm glad that the opportunity was kind of thrown at you like that, but you were up to muster. You know what I mean, to be able to handle it. And I'd say at least 2/3 of the applicants I see these days aren't. You know, they still think liking it is enough, and I wonder a bit if that's because the industry has not upheld the value of a bud tender.
I think you make a really strong point there because, I was making less money back then. Obviously, the economy was different, but all the people I was working by were extremely passionate and they went out of their way to learn about cannabis just based on what we could get our hands on, the things that we had access to. I'd say that the science has really taken a big step forward. Um, but what's been left behind is maybe the respect people have for bud tenders and the nuance in having those conversations with people and being able to decipher, hey, this is what I'm looking for, what that actually means, and then the options that are available to you to present to them.
Right.
And I definitely feel you there because, I was a bud tender for many years. I worked my way up pretty naturally in the industry, just worked hard. Had good vibes with people that I worked
Mm-hmm.
with. Still, even today, like a lot of people I've worked with, I'm just not interested in burning bridges. Um, I'm still close with people I worked with from the first shop
Mm-hmm.
that I worked at. So, having said that, I think that the crop has changed, as in not the cannabis plant itself. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
has changed, but the group of people wanting
Mm-hmm.
to get into the industry, I think, is much different now than it was then.
Mm-hmm.
And just from my experience and the people I used to bud tend with, we've
Mm-hmm.
all moved up or moved out. So
Yeah.
you won't see me as a bud tender. Although I would love to give someone like really great personal
Mm-hmm.
service. Back then, I kind of made it my personal mission to educate others in the way
Mm-hmm.
that I was seeking to be educated as a bud tender. And so
Mm-hmm.
everything that I knew, um, all the things that I had researched and just kind of the nuance that I had sort of cultivated at that point, it
Mm-hmm.
was really important for me to pass that on to customers because I didn't see them as my customers. They weren't
Right.
they weren't mine, and they were people in the community that needed information. And the hope is that they would go and they'd be able to shop at other shops and know what they needed. It was
Mm-hmm.
about empowering
Every
these
time.
people. Exactly. And sometimes I would see them at other shops or I would deliver to them a couple years later.
Mm-hmm.
And I always just had really good experiences with them because my goal was to educate them and just teach them, hey, you could do this for yourself. You just have to
Right.
care enough about it. And then just kind of spend some of the time figuring out what genetics work for you personally. I mean, everybody's chemotype is different. I learned that over time, even with myself. And then even myself has changed over time as well. So things I used to like, maybe I don't like as much anymore. Um, or maybe, it's tough because some things flood the market like GMO and it's everywhere because it yields well. We're living in a little bit different time with rec um, because people are growing for production. It's a little bit different than just growing for the medicinal value. So you see less of the flowers that are less than 20%. You see a lot less of things that go 10, 11, 12 weeks to finish.
I need my
Yeah.
7 to 9, baby.
Yeah. And
Um.
9 is the cutoff for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So
Even
that's
so, some of
wild.
the big producers that even up here, like Freddy's Fuego, people
Mhm.
like Archive, like as far as pheno hunts go, sure you can play
Y'all
around a
got
little
Freddy
bit.
Swago in Oregon?
No, no, but I mean like Pacific
Mm,
Northwest, like
yeah,
it's
so, yeah, 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 yeah,
I know
yeah,
you
for
guys.
sure.
It's big in Seattle, and then down
Yeah,
here, Archive is really big, right?
huge.
Um, yeah, and it's again like from them, it's the genetics, right? Because where I come from, you'll see Archive proliferated throughout the state in California, top to bottom. It's just quality genetics. It's hard to beat, and so you see a lot of that with symbiotic. You see a lot of that. I keep name dropping people like Gage Green and stuff, but the reality is when you're cultivating for the plant, it looks a lot different than when you're cultivating like right now for the consumer.
AK
Um,
commercially, yeah, for sure.
yeah, and even just the change from medical to rec. We've seen a lot of strains that I think people would love to see come back, but they take too long to finish a lot of times, so you just don't see them.
And where are the people who had those seeds? Some of them have died. Some of them have gone to jail during their time period. Some of them have moved and lost it all. You know what I mean? There's a lot of stuff that has happened for those people because it has never been simple growing weed. Okay, like it's a weed. It'll grow anywhere, but to make it a business and put it places when you were going against the United States government. Okay, it's
Yeah.
risky areas. Humboldt County is not to be trifled with. As much as y'all love to talk about the Emerald Triangle, Junction,
Yeah.
not to be trifled with. These areas,
Mhm.
you know what I mean. Different parts of BC, and that is where some of the best genetics have been developed and grown and cultivated over time, on the West Coast. But so, thank you for sharing that. I want to say in general, right? We get your genesis and your entrance into the weed industry. What's been your experience since that point working in weed? Like, okay, because you kind of share the things that you've seen, but you went from bud tender, and where are you now? Maybe level up on them a little bit.
Yeah. So now I do a lot of the marketing. The creative side of it, and also the not so creative side of it. The creative side is definitely the most fun part. When then the not so creative side is where you can make like a lot of good connections with people. I mean, this is how we met, right? Um, and so for myself, that was always kind of the trajectory was like, how do I get to this spot? How do I get to this point? And that took, starting out as a bud tender to a delivery driver, bud tender, production, bud tender, production, marketing. And then I've just been doing marketing kind of since then. I've worn a few different hats. I've gotten to work inside grows as well. But for me, marketing is kind of where I excel. My brain just kind of works in that way. And then I just have a few different creative assets that have let me be pretty successful.
Right. All right. I mean, you touched on some of it earlier. You dabbled in a bit of cannabis photography,
Right.
and you're talking about like how different that is in photography of other things. What were some ways?
So I've been lucky enough to work with some really great photographers that have taught me a lot. But the thing is, especially if we're talking about photographing like live plants, right? If we have to walk into cultivation, we're going into a grow, you got to account for lights, right? And that's a big thing. Is that like we were kind of touching on this a little bit earlier, kind of before we started recording, but like production becomes kind of a big thing. And if you can take care of a lot of the tedious work, I guess, on the front end, like making sure your lighting is set up, making sure that you have the right lenses with you, just in case, if you want to get those closer shots, making sure that just like the little things of being able to communicate well with whoever's managing the grow. Um, to see if you can get time alone with shots, if you can have them help you turn off fans, adjust lighting, like I was saying before, things like HPSs or throw a lot of yellow. And then when it comes to post production for photography, I mean, it just becomes a lot of work. So if you're trying to do this, whether you're scaling it and you have a lot of shots you're taking care of, it's just something to take note in because then you don't want to create a bunch of extra work for yourself if you can avoid it, right? Um, you know, some of the other places that I've really been like spend a lot of time is in the graphics, right? So graphic design is a passion of mine, right? And so it's a way for I found I could use my art background to make a career, uh, build on top of those skills, with videography, with photography, just really anything that's kind of a little bit more on the visual creative side. And that stuff really helps me build out campaigns and helps me translate my ideas when I'm talking to decision makers, when I'm talking to a team that I'm working with, or a team I work for. It's really important to be able to show people this is what the vision is. This is what it's going to kind of look like. It can change, but having those visual assets really helps me communicate in the space.
Okay. Yeah, hands down. I mean, that's the point of infographics and things of that nature. Period. Right? Like to convey what music the scoring isn't, or the actors on screen isn't, or whatever you have put together.
Yeah,
But that whole concept in the background, understanding that's marketing, right? And so
right,
like the average person doesn't even think that through. Like that, even though this 30-second commercial, its purpose is to display the new chicken sandwich. All these different graphics that they tossed in
right.
there was, you know what I mean, these key
The value
features that,
points,
right,
right?
exactly. And there's someone in behind like chiseling away at the strategy long before,
Yeah,
like picking color, picking sound, picking all of these things, rate of text. You know what I mean? There's someone
right.
that has to put all that together. And in the cannabis space, where marketing is such a regulated thing, right? Because they're
Yes, very
concerned
much
of
so.
the children, and
Right.
you know what I
Yeah,
mean, promotion of illicit substances, because we still haven't descheduled this mug. Even though we know it's just a plant, and you don't care if us talking about the new corn mazes, you don't care about the new genetics. Candy grapes is back. You don't care
yeah,
about the
yeah.
gala Washington apples, but goodness, if it's a cannabis plant, the kids might fall out and become drug addicts. So, uh,
Yes. Yeah, and it's
what?
definitely more important for us to over-regulate a plant than regulate pills at all, right? Um, the regulation's tough. I think it's difficult to deal with it um, when you're under the purview of it. Um, but I would say the people who probably have the largest task are people trying to make the changes. That's definitely something I don't want to have to deal with. And then it is tough. When I was in California, there was a point where the BCC, which I believe it now is the DCC, um, they didn't want us to have apparel. Something that might seem small, but where I worked, there's some very large breweries around us.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm wearing wig gear
And
right now. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, same.
Right.
And that was an easy one for us to get turned over in California. It was easy for us to just point to alcohol and be like, "Hey, what?" Um, and I worked right next to St. Archer and Ballast Point and Cutwater Spirits, and yeah, they sell merch all day long. It's another aspect of their business that doesn't actually have to do with the product itself, and so you would think it would be easier to kind of less regulation, but some people still kept going. I think it's like with cannabis. A lot of people just kind of keep rolling. They keep it
We just
moving.
work around it.
Yeah,
But it's not even just with. I mean, like, yes, entirely. You know a stoner that don't got a lighter and ain't gonna find a way to light a blunt. They will pull out a magnifying glass and use the sun if needed.
yeah.
Okay,
We've already
that
seen
is,
that.
yeah, that is the ingenuity that goes along with, I think, consuming something that taps into your nervous system, that helps you unlock and be settled enough to make a little bit make decisions that are a little bit outside the box, you know what I mean, or figure out the puzzle that was seemingly way too complicated before. I'm calm now. I'm seeing with a clearer vision. Let's go.
Yeah, your
Or
focus.
right, or actually, you know what? I'm not focused at all, and I've because like my brain needed to shut up so I could just do the thing. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that's the opposite. And that's why intentional use of cannabis is so important. How does it make you respond, right? And no matter how many times you ask me as the bud tender how this makes me feel, will I ever tell you it's going to make you feel the same way? Because we don't have the same system. We don't process
Yeah, and
things the
so
same.
well that's the prudent way to go about it, right? Like that's if you're careful. I don't know. Sometimes bud tenders will want to tell me whatever they want to tell me. A lot of times I go into it, like I was saying earlier, I know what I'm looking for. But you make a good point. Everybody's chemotype is different. Everybody reacts differently to cannabis. So, I talk to people every day that are like, oh yeah, indica doesn't make me sleepy and sativa doesn't make me awake. And that's fine. I mean,
Just understand what it does to you. Be intentional.
yeah, and we're still learning about it. Like every day it seems like every month I see something new coming out about terpenes. I see some new stuff come out about volatile sulfurous gases have different smells. And I think just the more we can understand the nuance, the more we're going to be able to understand the plant. But I still feel like you're going to have to find what works for you. That's just the
You're the
reality.
experiment, baby.
Yeah,
You
it could be cool too. It's like a little scavenger hunt.
right.
If you keep your notes. But I do know it can be frustrating for some people if they're looking for, you know, something that's going to replace their red wine, right? It's not going to be exactly like that. I mean, it's a different feeling. The
But we got
body
seltzers
processes
over
it
here,
different. Yeah, yeah. There's some good ones, right? There's a
hmm
bunch of good ones,
so there
but
might be
it's not
something
exactly the
close.
same.
Mhm.
It'll be close.
Well, with keeping your notes, what are the key strategies you've learned in your cannabis marketing career, local versus national?
So national is something we haven't been able to tap too much into, and you can with social media, you could definitely get eyes on what you're doing, but from what I do, marketing, we like to have metrics and analytics, and how does that translate into a sale? The best way to do maybe something national would be if you have a strong brand, you have a presence, and you have a following, and then you can move merch. And so that's a really strong way to do it. A lot of people lean into, like where I'm from, the Jungle Boys are huge, right? Merch is the way that they've been able to reach everybody. But the brand is so strong, they're getting ripped off in New York, they're getting ripped off in London, they're getting ripped off everywhere. In Spain, I think there's a smoking lounge in Spain with their name. But that just shows you the success that they've had and the impact that they have on the culture. And so for me, working in marketing, trying to understand how to bring this to whatever brand or company that I'm working for, I think a lot of it boils down to the user experience. I think that this is something that you could build a lot of your strategies off of, whether it's an email campaign that has dynamic content where people are being targeted, um, or you have a website that responds differently based on someone's age group, based on the analytics you have. There are ways to kind of build out dynamic content within media that's online that can target people from state to state if they're coming from California, and you can kind of speak to that, or they're coming from the East Coast and you can kind of speak to that. But for me, that's where I see the most success is understanding the user experience, how is this person going to enjoy this product versus how am I going to talk to this person, and what are the products they already use, how do they like to consume already. And if you don't have this data, you can start broadly because people are going to consume for the most part based on what you see from like sales data. Flower is still number one, but you see like how at least in the last few years, with the development of vape cartridges, that's a convenience piece. And so if somebody who's on the go, maybe somebody needs something a little more discreet, understanding that user experience, understanding where that product fits in, it's a product that for specifically vape cartridges, and people like to have the convenience and they like to have the potency kind of just in their pocket. And a lot of times in the earlier days, cartridges weren't really as solid as they are now, but now you can get, it's not exactly the same for sure, but you can get a closer to flower experience from a vape cartridge than than you could have a few years ago.
Based off of the
Um,
quality of the extraction that you can get
yeah,
in a vape cartridge.
yeah,
Up
and
here, it's
it's
hash rosin all the way. You know what I mean? You can
right.
get to
And then
that
if you
point.
have the starting material to put towards that,
Yeah.
you can really make an incredible product. But if you don't understand the market at all,
Mm-mm.
someone's not going to really know if you can't educate them on what the benefits of hash rosin are, like what you're
Mm-hmm.
and solventless, right?
Right.
Versus a distillate. And I still hear it on a daily basis. I still see it a lot here where people have no idea the difference between botanical terpenes
Mm-hmm.
and cannabis
It's
derived
director
terpenes.
things. Yeah. Want to break
Um,
that down for them? Please share. Because I've
yeah,
been,
so
man.
so I think botanical terpenes are really popular, mostly because they're fairly cheap to get. And they're cheaper because the starting material can be a lot larger, right? So if you want something that tastes like strawberry, and then they can add that in, that's going to be derived from a lot of strawberries. Now with cannabis terpenes, usually, not always, because we do see some companies that have terpenes, but typically it's going to be starting material from that plant. Um, so sour diesel terps, you can back add these things. We see it a lot, but if you were to take something with botanical terpenes that calls itself sour diesel, and then actually sour diesel extract, say like it was a hash rosin that was solventless, and then actually capture those terpenes in there and the fats and all the extra fun, volatile kind of sulfuric compounds. That there's a difference between saying it's a certain strain and being strain specific, and you can taste that. The effects match that. I think what we see with a lot of botanical terpene products is stuff that doesn't have the same lasting effect, so people tend to go through it a little bit faster. Additionally, I feel like those tend to go into products that are a little more mass produced, like distillate or live resin, where you can get really large yields from the extraction process. I think people who, like what you just said, people who smoke hash rosin, whether it's out of a rig, whether it's in a Puffco or like an e-rig, or it's in a vape cartridge, I think you know what you're getting. Like, you're probably, if somebody's going to come and ask me for a hash rosin cartridge, chances are 9 out of 10, they know what they're looking for. They understand the product. Um, and somebody's looking for distillate, or they just want potency, which tends to usually be distillate, it's a very different product. The value points are different. You talk to those customers differently because that the blanket approach doesn't really apply here. Because those consumers, 100%, because those consumers are very different. Typically, anybody looking for solventless, they know what they're looking for. They understand the effects are different. They understand that the processes are typically result in a safer product to consume. Because, like with rosin in particular, the extraction process is heat and pressure. That's really simple. And I think when a lot of people, I think we will get to a point where people understand that, but then they're also going to need to understand that that's going to always be a small batch. You're not going to get the huge batches of distillate, and the product's going to be more expensive because it's a better product. And it's without oversimplifying it, it's definitely where I think we want to be, or at least some of us that have been in the industry long enough, where we want to see it.
Right. I mean, I would agree with you, but I've also had the consumer that's like, but does this dab taste like BHO? Because that's what I'm looking for. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
and
I'm
if
looking
that
for a dab, like, but to click, that's what I'm saying. He's intentional. He knows exactly what flavor he's looking for, and it made it easier for me to not sell him hash rosin and do anywhere. Let's stick here. These ones I know that comes across. You don't want it too much like weed. You don't want too much of the fake flavors. You want it somewhere in the middle, and I can find that product and that consistency for you through questions. Thank you for explaining botanical terps versus cannabis derived terps and.
Sure. And I just like to clarify,
Mhm.
just for anybody that might be watching this, that is pretty surface level. Like, I'm
Mhm.
not an extractor. I'm a
Mhm.
marketer.
Right. Wait.
I've worked in cannabis, but it's
Mhm.
it's really important for people to know that what I'm saying is pretty surface level.
Right. But I do want to say that like marketing is different in Washington. Marketing for cannabis brands is different in Washington from Oregon from California, what the
Yes.
brands have to market for. And that's based off of how the market was legalized. Here in Washington, I can attest to a horizontal integration. So your branding on the packaging, that's where most of the marketing budget resides in these companies, because they have to make them all look different and try to get as much information on there as possible in
Hmm.
hopes that bud tenders will sell their product to a patient or
Hmm.
a consumer, because they can see it better. Whereas Oregon, you're vertically integrated. So your marketing, what are your, please tell me, share with me, what is your main goals when you said, you pointed at the other ones before, but like for Oregon specifically, you don't care so much about packaging. They're coming to your store to buy your stuff, you know?
Yeah. Well, and so the store that I work for in particular, it's daily style, right? So it is very different. So the focus would be on if you have a cool exit bag, that's a cool opportunity to do some marketing. If you have, like we have like TV screens, like a lot of stores do, we have like, the digital kind of setup. Just making sure customers stay informed. And I think here in Oregon, it's really important to be honest, be as transparent as possible. You want people to know, and that really is dictated by the market. So like today, in today's market, people care about harvest dates. They want to know the flower's fresh. I think when you see people that don't shop by harvest dates, there's nothing wrong with that. But I would say people looking for harvest dates, they know what they're looking for. Whether they've been shopping for a long time, whether they grow their own cannabis, or maybe they're just, from Oregon and this is what they're used to doing is seeing what's fresh. Um, that's important. I think it's good for consumers to know that harvest dates matter, um, terpene percentages, and these are things that have changed over time. Now there's still people looking for THC, but for me personally, that's not the focus when we're doing marketing. It's talking about everything else because THC, in my opinion, isn't where all the value is, especially when that number can be inflated and it's chronically inflated. I think we're seeing that happen with some changes in Colorado, some changes in California, where potency is just dropping off. And it's not that the flower isn't good. It's not that something they're doing is different. It's really as simple as the tests are more accurately reflecting what's in there. And so I think some people it might be a rude awakening for, and I think for others, it might be a welcome change. I think people, at least within the cannabis industry, have been wanting to talk about the other value points for a long time. And I feel like that might be something we got away from when we left medical and we entered recreational. For the most part, medical doesn't function the way it used to um, in any of the states on the West Coast now. Um, and personally, that's kind of tough to see because of how I got in the industry. But also, there are way less medical consumers than there are recreational consumers,
Hmm.
and I think
Well,
it's just keeping
by
that education up.
stats, right? Let's
Right,
be fair and say that every cannabis consumer is a medical consumer, whether they know it or not.
right, right.
There is some form of relief or something that's happening on a molecular level. They're just not educated enough to be able to put it into language.
Well, or have the paperwork, right?
Right? True. So,
Because I guess
but
that's kind of what I'm coming from.
by
Yeah.
legal definition, there are far. I mean, we're suffering collapsing medical programs in the state of Washington.
Yes.
Realistically,
Yes.
all along the West Coast, I think, as a whole.
I honestly think it's a pretty big loss,
Hmm.
personally, um, because I think we see the shift happening in the market,
Hmm.
and what seems to be also being left behind is the activism that got us here. Which is, that's another
Woo!
conversation probably
Say
for us to
that.
have. Um, it's not really something we market too much, right? But I
Yeah.
definitely feel like the activism has fallen behind, and with 420 on the horizon, it's something we can really talk about
Right.
where it's become so marketable because people know it, and
Right.
it's just kind of
Well.
how the shift in the market has happened where the activism isn't around the way that it used to be, and those consumers may also not be around like they used to be either because of some of the restraints that we see with rec because potentially some of the taxation, you know, and again, I'm not trying to get too off topic here, but 420 has gone to very much the consumer model and have left the medical activism behind. And
It really
that's too
did.
bad. It really is too bad.
It hurts my heart a little bit. I mean, for me, 420 used to be a pre birthday celebration where I connected with my fellow cannabis consumers and we just had a sesh and enjoyed ourselves and really celebrated
Yeah,
the fact that this is something that we all do together and have seen some change in our lives as a result of doing. And that in itself is an act of activism. Us saying, hey, we are a member of that community. Us, who you
right.
wouldn't expect, you know what I mean? Or a
Yeah,
member of that community just lets people know, hey, we exist, and that's the first step in activism in my mind. But
yeah.
I guess with you bringing that up, what's your favorite 420 lore? You know what I mean? We talk about where we're disappointed at where we're at now, but what's your favorite?
Well, well, it's not too. I'm not like broken up about it so much as I'm trying to figure out how to get us back there. So that's one thing. So I think there's always a path back, right? Where we all get real excited about this thing that we have now, and then we try to figure out, okay, well, maybe this isn't working the way that it used to. Um, because it really used to be a big deal, right? You'd have the news would come out and they'd be like, "Oh my god, everyone's smoking weed. What the heck's going on? Why is it always on the same day?" The lore is crazy, though, right? I mean, I'm sure you know a bunch of stories, but since you asked, I think my favorite one has to be the map, right? It's like the story of the high schoolers where they would have the after school sesh at 420, and there was like a map that went with it. Um, I love that because it's got kind of like some mysterious kind of scavenger hunt feel to it,
Yeah.
which kind of feels like it would be really fun to do now
Mm-hmm.
as like a community event. But that, that one I think kind of ties in with the Grateful Dead as well. And I kind of feel like that story has been kind of turned into a few different same stories. But that's
Yes.
my favorite one.
It
It
goes through the rumor
feels,
mill.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It
yeah.
feels good though,
Right.
having a map that you have to like figure out where everybody else is at, and people just knew by some point it's time.
Yeah,
We'll meet at the
420. We're
spot.
gonna meet at this time. You know what I mean? This is the after schools. To me, it was like the after school session. You know, because like we're all in the daycare, aftercare programs. I don't know how old y'all are, but like 420, we gonna meet for sure. And I just to me, once I first, because I learned that early in my career that like that was the meaning. Not in my career, but in my experience in smoking cannabis, that was the meaning behind 420. And I was like, at that time, smoking in high school, and so like we would link up, after our classes or whatever to get high if we didn't have work. And so to me, I was like, oh, that's hella dope. But you didn't at that point in time, and we weren't walking around with like computers in our pockets. We weren't because like these cell phones so I had to get on a computer, dial up sort of Google to get this information. I think the second thing later on in life that I learned about 420 was the Vans logo. It's not the day of, but just things in relation to 420. I was like, aha, no wonder why I love that brand. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it was meant for me.
yeah. It's fun too because everybody seems to have a slightly different version,
Right.
which I feel like kind of makes it special. Um, it's so subjective, right? Where like even where you are regionally, like it
Right.
changes. And then we're both here on the West Coast, and it's different for us.
Right. I mean,
Um,
I was on the. I'm from Florida, so you know what I
right. So you're
mean.
from the South, and the
Yeah,
story is still different.
it's different.
Um, and I don't know. I like that. I guess I like
Mm-hmm.
that about 420 being like really subjective.
Because you
Um,
had to be in the know. That's what I loved about cannabis and the versus. You had to be a cool enough person to know someone to get the product from. That's and like we're moving on to the second part of this question. What do you dislike about marketing about 420 working in this industry? And I'll go first. I simply dislike working 420 as it's like our greatest day of sales, right? Everyone has to work that day. and you work somewhere between like long shifts, and while every customer is having this delightful time, you are being run ragged behind the counters, right? But more importantly for me, it's just like sometimes I think of like, you wouldn't even know what was going on this day back in the, you wouldn't be cool enough to know who was selling what and linking up where and having what kind of party. And now simply because it's around the block from your house or the Walmart you go to, you're coming up and you're buying stuff and you don't even know what you're talking about right now. And so like,
Yeah,
you
and that
know?
is maybe it's kind of suffering the corporate treatment, right? Where
Yeah.
you see that it has the ability, like Black Friday. I mean, Black Friday is
Oh
still
my
super busy in the industry
gosh.
too, like Green Wednesday or Friday or whatever. Um, but yeah, it is. I think for me, the biggest one is losing the activism. Kind of what I was saying before, where it functioned more as like a protest in a way, and now it's you know, deal day. Um,
And I think
and to be honest, I
the
mean, I think when a lot of these, it's like a lot of pieces we could talk about with it, right? But within
mhm,
recreational cannabis, 420 falls, and we're gonna get kind of a little more corporate with it, and we're gonna walk away from the industry conversation. But
mhm,
420 falls in the second quarter. A lot of times, people are trying to recover from the losses in that first half of the year, and it's tough to say, but like if we could inject some more of the activism and get people excited about 420 events, make more events, which I
mhm.
know that's like a big thing for you.
Yeah.
It'd be really great to see some of it shift away from deals, savings, and all that, kind of lift some of the pressure off of the retailers. And like what you're talking about, I'd love it to just be able to have like a communal 420 break. And, we know what that's for. Because yeah, when you're working 420, and you've worked all day, and a lot of times you work long hours, you, the 420 break doesn't exist for you if you're on shift, and then the 840 break doesn't really count anymore if you're gonna do double down on 420. You know what I mean? Like it's 840, you smoke twice. Um, it's it just doesn't happen for a lot of us, and I've worked 420 for years now. And now on the marketing side, I usually do media and stuff on that day, which is by no means the same as being on the retail side, taking customers. It's totally different. But just getting some of the activism back I would love that. I would love to see that.
I think that's a perfect way to close this episode because, we try to roll events, the industry, the culture, and the activism all in one. That's really a synopsis of living the Bakersman lifestyle because I think to be a true functional pothead, you got to do it all, right?
Yeah,
If you
I
love
know,
this
right?
plant, you got to do it all. So I really appreciate you for taking the time out to chat with us today, Matt, about all these different subjects. But mainly, tell us what's next for you and where can they find you? Because clearly you're full of insight, right?
Hey, well, I kind of am usually in the background. I do a lot of the media stuff. But you could always find me on Instagram. You can get into contact with me at Easygoing Creative Company. Um, you could come see me in Oregon. And yeah, I try to keep it pretty low key, to be honest.
hmm
I'm happy to have these conversations and talk cannabis, but I
hmm
do like being the face behind the camera a lot of times.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I love having these conversations. Feel free to hit me up on social media, Instagram especially,
Okay.
or come say what's up in Oregon.